Hi, I'm Chris Fleming, the creator of Spirit Talk. You're listening to the podcast where I'll be bringing you the greatest thinkers, researchers, and contributors from around the world to discuss what we know in the field of the paranormal, life after death, and the pursuit of higher consciousness. Hey, it's Chris Fleming. Welcome back to Spirit Talk. This episode, we talk about para-Cymatics, waves, consciousness, rips in time, and UFOs. My guest is none other than Joshua P. Warren. Joshua is a paranormal investigator and a researcher who does many things. He's an international TV personality. He's been heard on many different radio shows, including Coast to Coast AM, and he's a published author who's written such books as Haunted Ashville, How to Hunt Ghosts, and the 2015 bestseller, Use the Force, A Jedi's Guide to the Law of Attraction. Now, he's also the creator of Speaking of Strange Radio and the president of Shadowbox Entertainment Enterprises, and I remember those figures from years ago. But also, he's the owner of the Asheville Mystery Museum and the Haunted Ashville Ghost Tours. Now, he's published articles that have been represented internationally in such mainstream media as CNN, Fox News, Popular Mechanics, Entertainment Weekly, Southern Living, Delta Sky, Fate, New Women, New York Times, FHM, and a couple other issues and magazines out there. Now, he's also the inventor of Para-Cymatics research. He now divides his time between Asheville, North Carolina, and Las Vegas, Nevada, where he's building a new workshop and laboratory to study activity in the western United States. Now, you can check out his website, joshuapwarren.com. And you know, Joshua, I'm thinking about the first time we ever met, and that's got to be, maybe around the middle to late 90s. And it was at a meeting with a friend of mine, Tom Cameron, who is a martial artist, and he would practice and display the death touch.
That's right, in Chicago there, and thank you so much for having me on your podcast. You know, one of the interesting things about that trip was that was the first time I actually got to test out Tom Cameron when he was projecting energy. And, you know, he does these controversial demonstrations where he appears to knock people down without touching them, kind of like Darth Vader using the Force, right? And we did this experiment with him where I have a buddy named Joe Southard's, big guy, about 6'5", and we took a Kirlian photograph of Joe's finger when he was in his normal resting state. Now, this shows the electricity passing through your body. And so he had a normal circle of blue light right around his fingertip. And then we had Tom do one of these touchless knockouts on Joe right as we took a second picture. And not only did Big Joe go down, but in the second picture, guess what? It showed not just one corona of electricity around that fingertip, but two of them, as if his energy body had literally been knocked ajar from his physical body. And so we're not talking about something that's like a smear here or some kind of a motion blur. I think I literally got an image, maybe the first time ever, of a guy's energy field being knocked out of his body. And so meeting you on that trip and talking to you about the spirit realm and the relationship between the mind and the body and all that was especially fitting, because that's what we're talking about, understanding the overlap between those two profound subjects.
Right. And I think the thing that's unique with your perspective and your philosophy that I got from that meeting is, I don't know if it was that exact day, but I think you either spoke that night or you spoke not too long after that. You were showing the analogy with the fan, how the fan's spinning, and then you would take a strobe light and then you would actually see the blade. And what people don't understand is, when a fan's spinning really fast, you don't really see the blade. You just see this blur. But Joshua's perspective was dealing with vibration and frequency. And it was something I had not really heard talked about that much in the paranormal field. And when he did this experiment, and then you could see the blade clear as day, even though it was spinning, it was remarkable because it reminded me of certain apparitions and appearances of ghosts in the past, where one minute they'd be there and the next minute they weren't. And I started toying in the back of my mind, wow, frequency, vibration. And that's where I started following more in my own research because of what I've learned from you that night.
Well, thank you, because, to me, I always try to reduce things down to some kind of a lab experiment or a practical demonstration. And that's kind of how my mind works. I actually have a very quote unquote scientific sort of approach to the world. And for many years, I actually was a lab assistant for a NASA Hall of Fame scientist named Charles Yost. And
Wow.
eventually, I made the cover of a science journal for some experiments that I did adapting strange phenomena like the brown mountain lights into lab experiments. And so I think it's important to be able to, instead of just talk about these things from a metaphysical perspective, to also be able to show how that there is a practical angle on all of this. And demonstrations like that, they can really open your mind and make you realize why that you can even increase your chances of photographing some of these strange phenomena if you know how to set up your camera properly.
There's so many ghost hunters out there. There's so many paranormal investigators, and you can't even put that term on you because you think way outside of the box. You look at not just at paranormal experiences, but what's causing it to the electromagnetic field. How is it in certain vibrations and frequencies, and all this type of stuff that I want to have you share with us more. Your work has crossed over to UFOs, ghosts, various forms of healing, chi energy, consciousness, etc. What would you say to the listeners right now that is your current focus and research that you're working on today?
Well, of course, I am building this new laboratory in Las Vegas. I have got a temporary one here where I've been already doing some, I think, pretty fascinating work. And one of the things that I believe is perhaps the key to answering that question is this field you mentioned that I created a couple of years ago called Para-Cymatics.
Hmm.
And so let me sort of do my best to put that in a nutshell. It really began in the late 1700s with this German scientist and musician named Ernst Chladni, who realized that when you take something like a thin piece of metal and sprinkle salt or fine powder on it and you run a violin bow down the side, the powder will snap into all these beautiful patterns that look kind of like snowflakes. And so now we can reproduce that in the modern era using speakers that play different kinds of tones. And it not only works with something like a fine particulate like salt or powder, but you can also play it through 3D substances like, well, water or semi-liquid like corn starch and water combinations. And you can see these ridges come up in all these 3D shapes. Well, I became really interested and that relationship between creating a vibrational mold and how that mold holds physical matter, even though it's kind of difficult to understand how that connection is breached. But here was the real clincher for me. I went down to Key West, Florida, and I studied Robert the Haunted Doll for a while and did a national news report for Coast to Coast AM. Robert the Haunted Doll, of course, he's over 100 years old. There's you could do a whole show just on Robert the Haunted Doll. In fact, I wrote a book about him. But anyway, I got to be the first person to shine a UV light on him with the glass case removed because glass blocks most UV.
Yeah.
And when I did this, I saw this pattern that was only visible on his sleeve that looked very much like a weird snowflake, like some of these paracymatic patterns. And I wondered what the connection could be. And then later on, I found an old medieval grimoire with all these magical symbols called sigils. And there was one that looked very much like the one on the sleeve of Robert the Doll. And the story always was that he was created by a voodoo priestess, etc. So this gave me an idea. What if I can take different intentions, what maybe somebody in the past would consider a spell or a ritual? What if I can put that into a tone? What if I can see the pattern that tone creates in water? Then I can capture that pattern and expose myself to it and see if anything changes in my day-to-day routine. And so I started with basic stuff like, well, I want to attract more ghosts, or something practical. I'd like to attract more money, or I would like to have more paranormal experiences or psychic experiences in my dream state. Or you can put any message you want into the water. I made a whole list of these symbols. I put them on my website for free. You can still find them there at joshuapwarren.com. And I told people, go there, get these symbols, and I want you to just expose yourself to this, whatever symbol you're into. One for relationships, one for pets. Somebody asked me to pet protection. I did all these sigils, so people go there, they get these, and they just look at them 2 or 3 times per day. And I have to tell you, Chris, not one day has gone by over the past 2 years when I have not received an email from somebody telling me this amazing story about something highly unlikely that happened just by being exposed to these sigils. And again, it's all free. This is an experiment, and I can't wait to hear what some of your listeners say after they go and try this out. So I call this Para-Cymatics because this is a field of taking the cymatic principle, but injecting it with intention to create magical sigils.
That's incredible. Now, explain to the listeners a little more about sigil. What does that mean?
Well, it comes from the ancient word sigillum, Latin word, which basically means to seal. And so the idea is that when a practitioner of old would conduct some kind of a ritual, there would be a culmination, a point at which the whole thing came together, and that would therefore be condensed into this one pattern that usually looks very abstract, not always, but it defies the boundaries of common language in most cases, because we're talking about something more organic, about the human consciousness relating to the environment. And you get these weird looking sigils or shapes that basically act like an antenna to attract that energy from that ritual. So the idea is that the energy of the ritual can create this symbol, and therefore, if you're around that symbol, then it is opening you up to the energy on the other side. It's almost like a primitive form of broadcasting, and it's hard for us to wrap our minds around exactly how all this can work, but the fact that it does seem to work so effectively tells us a lot about the relationship between the mind, the body, and the environment.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I think of like Ramsey says, it's written, therefore it shall be done. And then when you affect your field, your environment, that we know, law of attraction, The Secret, stuff like that, Definite Purpose, Napoleon Hill, is not only are you projecting it from what I'm gathering from listening to you, not only is your thoughts, but then also these sigils, if you play them or you have that image with you, it's also projecting into electromagnetic field all around you?
Certainly. In fact, I now have taken this study to what I call Para-Cymatics 2.0. This is brand new. I only just started talking about this about a month ago. And what I have done is figure out a brand new system. This is, again, something that I've developed where I can take images of things that exist out there, images of crop circles, the Great Pyramids at Giza, Stonehenge, human DNA, double helix, could be the Andromeda galaxy, or what. I can take a picture of something, I can scan it with lasers, and then I can take the light from the laser and reflect it into a little electronic unit that will convert that light into sound.
Wow.
That sound gets played into a computer where I create a tone that goes into the water that gives me a sigil. So now I have a tone that I can get from an image as well as a sigil. And so I just recently posted some of these on my website. And so the idea is, okay, if you want to experiment with the Great Pyramids, you can go and listen to what the Great Pyramids sound like. You can play that and see what happens. This is all experimentation. So I'm getting more and more advanced in ways of converting things into tones.
Joshua, you just got me all these things going through my head right now with wanting to experiment with you. If we have, like, for example, I have photographs of ghosts that have been captured. I'm not talking about orbs, dust, and stuff like that. I'm talking about semi-manifestations.
Mm-hmm.
Say we are at a location where we capture an anomaly on camera, and it could be a mist, it could be a face, it could be a torso. And you took that and you scanned that in with the laser and turned it into a sound. Then we took that sound and we played that sound back into the room where it was witnessed. I wonder if the entity would manifest again, or come towards, or how it would respond to that audio.
Well, you see, now that is exactly the kind of experimentation that needs to be done, because I would imagine that by doing something like that, you would reinforce the energy of that being and probably increase the odds of it appearing or something else happening. And you see, and this is great because when you're taking something like this and you're sort of playing it back on itself, it becomes sort of like a finely tuned Tesla coil where these two different vibrations begin to harmonize and reinforce each other, and they get faster and faster and faster and faster and build up a sense of momentum and power. And so I think that would be a wonderful experiment. It has not been done to my knowledge, so this is something we should definitely do.
Absolutely. And I'm going to keep this in mind. I'm making a note of this because that is just so interesting. We talk about photos with sound. There's one thing that I noticed doing a lot of EVPs over the last 20 years, and it was something that I started to notice more. And I remember Frank Sumption telling me once, he called me on the phone when he was alive, and we were talking about certain things, and he said he wanted to email me something. So he sent me some images, and he was stating that through the spectrum, the audio spectrum, using the audio program, he was able to see faces in the audio. And at first, I thought he was crazy. I thought it was pareidolia. And in some instances, I believe it was pareidolia, because when you can get so obsessed and so overwhelmed with something, you're tending to see it everywhere. And that becomes a little bit of matrixy and pareidolia, which takes away from some scrutiny and some skepticism where you step back and say, okay, it's not there, but it's here. It's not there, but it's here. Well, I started noticing when we had more evil type entities, per se, in those EVPs, that I was seeing faces. And I would show the spectrum to some of my colleagues, and I'm like, there's a face there. I said, yeah, what does it look like? It looks like this. I said, exactly. And it's just like, what the heck? And I start seeing it more and more in some of audio files. Not all of them, but some of them. So I became wondering that audio also can capture not just, a form of language, communication, verbally, but can also capture images. So I'm just wondering what can be done. You guys got me thinking of all these ideas that can be done with some of this research you're doing here to kind of boost and communicate in various ways with, spirits or entities. I don't know.
Well, I think, a great example of what you're saying here is that for those who don't really study the electromagnetic spectrum, for example, it's all really one big expression of energy pulsations. So if it's at a low frequency, we call it radio waves, which are big giant waves. And then, of course, as they get smaller, well, then they turn eventually into microwaves, which are about the size of a bumblebee. And then they get even smaller and they become infrared light. And then there's this little space right in the middle where the frequencies are just perfect to interact with our eyes. And that's what we are able to see as the colors red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. And then it keeps getting smaller. And from there, it gets into ultraviolet and then X-rays and then gamma rays and all this sort of thing. But it's all the same stuff. We are only able to usually see one tiny little sliver of it. And so I think when we start looking at these relationships between light and sound and the human experience, we have to consider that they all do connect in some way. It's just a matter of us finding the best way to illustrate that. And that's why I find that when you get to this kind of research, certainly you could even say this level of research, it starts to blur the line between what we usually think of as science and art. And that's because, for example, when I am going to scan an image of, say, the Great Pyramids, the very first decision that I have to make is, well, what image am I going to use? Mm-hmm. There are many different angles on the Great Pyramids. Do you do one from overhead or from looking up from the ground or a profile? And so the very fact that I have to go in and start the process by selecting the representative image shows that there is something very subjective about the process of figuring out how to begin. but in that sense, it's also a very good representation of how all research is really influenced in this same way, because we have this misconception that, well, you have these scientists who are out there using instruments that cost a fortune and using the various methods, and then you have these wacky people like you and me who go out and study ghosts and aliens and stuff. But the reality is, every single scientific instrument that's being used out there was conceived by a human, built by a human, calibrated by a human, used by a human, interpreted by a human. You cannot take the human element out of this, no matter how much you want to. And so therefore, I think that we just have to accept that in order to make some advances in understanding these odd relationships, and we're making some serious advances between the mind, the body, and the environment. We also have to realize that to a certain extent, it's going to have some sloppy, rough edges, because we are going to have to include the subjective human experience in there as well.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is based on our perspective, our belief system, it can, sometimes prohibit us fully understanding the experience. There was about, I think it was about maybe 6 years ago, I was with my friend Johnny Rico, and we were doing a spirit box, and I wanted to talk to Tesla or Edison, because I want to ask them, how can we perfect ITC communication? And we heard both their names mentioned during the session. It came through clear. And I said, Tesla, Edison, what is it we really need to focus on to perfect spirit communication? What is it, And clear as day, it comes out and it says, waves. Well, okay. Waves are everywhere, right? And I don't fully understand that. I realize, okay, yeah, broadcast, EVPs, audio, there's waves or frequencies, but that's like a needle in a haystack when you say that. I mean, what would you determine from them saying that, from across the afterlife, and just saying waves?
Well, I think that it's probably the most simple and fundamentally profound thing that you could say. Because what we've sort of discovered as we've learned more and more about these relationships is that, going back to the idea of the electromagnetic waves on the EM spectrum, if I were made of radio waves, then I could not pass through a wall of radio waves. The radio waves, which are all around us right now, would seem like a physical structure to me, because you cannot pass through something else that has the same sort of resonance that you have. And so that is why that physicality is a relative thing. And so therefore, two things can be physical to each other if they're similar, but if they are dissimilar, then they don't interact and they pass right through each other. So to that degree, every single thing that exists in the universe is both physical and non-physical, depending on the other thing that you're relating it to. And if we therefore consider that there is no fine line that ultimately, from a divine point of view, if you want to look at it that way, determines that this is physical and that's not, that this is always an egocentric situation that's based upon the position of the specific perspective of the observer, then it shows you that any type of spiritual phenomena that's out there, any type of exotic technology that's out there that may come from other dimensions or other planets, is all accessible to us if we're able to find some way to change their wave structure and just enough so that we can access it. So let me give you another example of this. When Thomas Edison, when he invented the phonograph, people thought he was a fraud, because people said, look, you can't record a sound. I mean, what is a sound? A sound, that's it doesn't make any sense. Wow. You can record a sound. And so he had to go out and do demonstrations for people and prove that he could record a sound and play it back, and people still didn't believe it. They still thought that this was a gag and there was a ventriloquist somewhere, or there was a hidden tube. And the thing is, they weren't grasping that he wasn't literally recording the sound itself. What he was recording was a physical representation of the sound, which was the next best thing, which gave us a handle on it and gave us a way to start working with it and appreciating it. So even though there may be things out there like the spirit realm that we might not ever be able to capture and put in a bottle on the shelf in the lab in the museum, for example, we still can find a way to capture these energies in the same representative form that Edison captured sound, and that's by looking at how to get an impression from the spirit that's maybe as far as we're going to be able to go with our interactions until we ourselves pass on and become a part of that particular frequency.
Well said. Like you just said right there, particular frequency. I'm sitting there thinking it's because we exist on a different frequency, on a different vibration. And if you want to call it, various dimensions that exist from different frequencies, if you are vibrating at a certain speed or frequency or emitting a certain frequency, you're going to be here. If you're slightly different, you're going to be here. And that could actually represent various dimensions per se. So let's do that. Let's talk about the universe, time dimensions, holographic universe, things we consider, paranormal, scientific, and energy that people can start paying attention to in this world we live in. They can start learning from, because I know you and I had a brief conversation when we were preparing for the live episode for Ghost Adventures. We were in the back room waiting to go on the show, and we started striking up some conversations, and I was curious, like, what you thought about the universe and time, and you were just like, oh my God, I totally am involved in that in research. So share with the listeners. Let's get into some conversations about time and holographic images.
This is one of my favorite topics right now. Last year, when I decided to finally set up a more permanent base camp here in Las Vegas, I was just looking for an excuse to visit Area 51. I'd never been there. And of course, Area 51 is about a 2-hour drive north of Vegas, out in the desert in the middle of nowhere. And it's not like some tourist attraction. I mean, this is a bona fide, classified military installation. And so I was trying to figure out, what I should do up there. I could have night vision goggles and stuff like that, so I could obviously go up and look for things. But around that time, I was contacted by an engineer, a Silicon Valley engineer named Ronald Heath, and he told me that he had invented a meter for the guy who has every other meter in the world. And so he was talking about me because he's been following my work for a while. And it's called a differential time rate meter, or DT meter. Ron Heath is a big fan of the X-Files. And he's retired. He just retired like last year, so he's got some time on his hands to work on projects that he always wanted to create. And there was an episode of the X-Files where Mulder goes to investigate a UFO sighting, and he has 2 stopwatches. He synchronizes them. He leaves one at his car. He takes the other out to where the UFO was seen, and then he comes back and he compares them, and they're out of sync. And so the implication is that at the spot where the UFO appeared, some technology was used that bent gravity, i.e. space-time, to some degree that had some residual effects. And so he created a meter that would basically duplicate this process. The DT meter has 2 oscillating chips that basically act like 2 synchronized watches, and they're connected by 100-foot coil of wire. And so you calibrate them, and then you roll them 100 feet apart, and there is always supposed to be a perfect synchronicity, or a perfect synchronization between the 2 of them. Now, there is a wide margin of error, just in case there's some background noise from something electronic or whatever. But he said it's always supposed to stay in sync. And he'd had 2 of these things running in California for 2 months, logging their data 24 hours a day, and they'd never been out of sync. He said they're not supposed to go out of sync unless something crazy happens, like a black hole approaches Earth or something like that. So I figured, well, I'm going to take this to Area 51, because you have people like Bob Lazar out there who have claimed that he worked there and they were working on some kind of gravity warping technology that was back engineered from a crashed saucer. So my wife, Lauren, and I, we drove up there. We spent the night, drove back. Along the way, I'd stop about every 20 miles and get out and just take a control reading. And so I thought maybe as I get closer to Area 51, uh, everything will be normal. And then all of a sudden it'll start getting a little wonky up there. And then I'll come back and it'll be normal again. And I could say, oh, there's something weird happening at Area 51. Well, actually, that didn't happen. At Area 51, everything seemed quite normal. However, there was this one little spot 20 miles north of Las Vegas at this nondescript area on the side of the road where I happened to get out to take a control reading. And I got this extremely anomalous reading that showed that time there slowed down 25 microseconds per second. Now, that's very small, but it's not supposed to happen at all. So I told Ronald Heath about this. He was amazed. And then this is the real kicker. I then found out that that little nondescript spot in the desert is one of the biggest UFO hotspots in the area, where incredible video of UFOs has been filmed over and over, where a guy, at least one person I know of, had a close encounter there. I actually went out with him to this spot. He is an engineer, very no-nonsense kind of guy. This happened to him in 1996, and it was such a profound thing that he brought a model with him of the craft that was floating right over his head for 10 minutes. And I mean, I thought there's no way this can be a coincidence. So the local news heard about this. It got picked up and went all over the world. I mean, made international news, Newsweek and CBS and Fox News and all that kind of stuff. And people started interviewing me about this, saying, well, come on, surely there must be some other explanation, some equipment failure. And I was saying, well, look, I understand that I'm the first person apparently who's had the opportunity to go out and get one of these anomalies, but I predict that they're all over the place out there, and we just haven't had the technology to really start capturing them yet, and that within 10 years, this won't be a big deal. Well, guess what, Chris? About 2 weeks ago, I was watching the History Channel. There was this television show that debuted, and it was following the work of David Paulides, who is this detective. He's a retired detective, and he goes out into the national forest and documents all these reports of people who vanish inexplicably, sometimes in the blink of an eye. And during this show, they went to Mesa Verde in Colorado, and he went out there with 3 scientists, 2 of them rocket scientists. These are bona fide professionals, and they brought out a setup that is similar, but it uses lasers, and they documented one of these anomalies at Mesa Verde, and David Paulides even took that data to a university and talked to a physicist who analyzed everything, peer-reviewed it, and said, yes, we can't explain this. This is an anomaly. This is a time anomaly. So that's 2 time anomalies. One that I discovered, one that these guys discovered, and we can get into what this means. But I definitely want to make it clear that I said we are going to start finding them all over the place, and I think it's happening.
There's something I want to wait till you explain a little further, because there's something I want to say, but I don't want to give it away if it's something that you're going to say. How do you think this is happening? Why is this happening?
So, for one thing, I tend to believe that the Earth naturally has what we can call interdimensional weather. We are aware of atmospheric weather. We're aware of space weather. You could even say that we're aware of geologic weather, if you want to call that, earthquakes and tremors. But in the same way, I think that we have such a dynamic system here being bombarded by forces that we don't even understand, that we haven't fully discovered, that there are times when certain conditions become right, especially at places like the Bermuda Triangle or Brown Mountain, where we have the Brown Mountain Lights, or even here in Nevada, where they have what they call the Nevada Triangle. Places like that are prone to interdimensional weather. So that is to say, like if you go to Oklahoma 90% of the time, maybe it's going to be a beautiful day, but you get there on that one day when the conditions are right, and there's this big, magnificent, beautifully designed, symmetrical thing called a tornado that appears and comes through and tears the place all to heck. And so it could be that, it's difficult for us to predict when an earthquake's going to happen, or where a tornado is going to be, and all that. But we know that they happen when the conditions are just right. So I do think there is such a thing as interdimensional weather, which is a natural thing. Now, here's where that gets more complicated. I also think that it's possible that visitors to this planet, whether they be from what we call other planets or other dimensions, or maybe those are one and the same, when they come here and they are navigating our planet, they know more about this planet than we do. And they are actually aware of some of these highways, of some of this interdimensional weather, of some of these places where this stuff occurs. And so they traverse those areas. Maybe it even helps because maybe there's less of a gravitational force to deal with as they're flying their craft around. I don't know. But military is interested in studying these things and figuring out how they do what they do. And so military clusters have built up around these places where these UFOs have been regularly seen. And so they're doing their own research, trying to reproduce the technology. So sometimes you're picking up these anomalies because it's a natural spot on the Earth. It's a weak spot, what the ancient Europeans would call a thin place. Sometimes when you're there, you might see a boost in what's happening because there is some alien technology present. Or sometimes you might see a boost in what's happening because we have humans that are trying to reproduce the alien technology. And this is what makes it so complicated, that it starts with something happening in Mother Nature and then everybody trying to use that to their advantage, just like we figured out how fires were created by lightning or whatever else when we were cavemen. And now what do? We use fire every single day to fly jets, to cook things. I mean, we harness things we find in nature, and that's what this is. It's a natural phenomenon that's being harnessed by our human technology and the technologies of other more exotic cultures.
When you talk about aliens and abductions, and I'm a firm believer of various species from various dimensions and parts of the multiverse, but when they go and create wormholes, doorways, when they go and abduct somebody and they use vibratory devices that change the vibration of the ceilings and the walls so that they can pull the person right through it, and where the ceiling will no longer exist and the person will just be floating right through it and go right up into the craft. Now, based on, I'm not going to get into how I know all that, but let's just say with all the accounts out there that have described that, and I will state the UFO sighting I saw years ago, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, I had posted it on my blog. And it was a wormhole that had opened up. First, I saw this glowing egg-shaped craft that was glowing internally, did not have the same type of reflection that normal lights on airplanes would have, that kind of star-like look. This was internal, and I thought it was very odd. But as it gravitated on a horizontal plane, I noticed up above, farther to the left, this spinning primordial type image that started to appear out of the black sky, and it was lit up as a cyan and a magenta and all these lightning bolts, and then I saw this little black hole that was in the middle of it. Then this thing did a slight 90-degree curved angle and went straight up vertically towards this, and as it got closer, there's more lightning bolts. As it went through it, it illuminated the funnel type opening. And then I became aware that, oh my God, I can't believe I'm seeing this. It changed color after it entered. The lightning bolts slowed down, and then all of a sudden this thing closed up. And I remember I checked my time to see what time it was, and then as I went down the street, I checked the time as I came in to my house, and I remember looking at my clock, and it's 9:15 p.m., and I'm blown away. And then all I remember is Sunday morning. That was Friday night I saw this. Is Sunday morning waking up and it pops into my head. I said, oh my God, I can't believe I forgot about it. I went online and did research about wormholes and all that other type of stuff. A long story, but to get back to the point, is it possible that the technology that they've done to create these doorways, as well as affecting certain environments and structures with the vibratory to pull people through, as well as maybe some of the experiments our government has done, has created these little slits in various areas on this planet that time has now been affected because the original space-time has been altered for something to pass through.
Yes, no doubt about it. I believe the term you may have used when we first talked about this was a scar that's left over.
Yes, scar, correct.
And see, that would make perfect sense to me because we know that this medium called time it's almost impossible for us to fully comprehend, but it must have some great power because that we so often consider it to be consistent, at least at one particular point in time. Now we know that it's not consistent throughout the universe. I mean, if you talk to physicists, they'll tell you, oh, sure, if you go out in space, you'll find differences, but they don't like to talk about it being in your backyard or your back bedroom or your dining room. And that's the reality. We're not just talking about something that only shows up when you're comparing, the Earth to a spaceship flying around. I mean, for example, it's been documented that a clock in your basement runs more slowly than a clock in your attic because the one in your basement is closer to the Earth's gravitational field. So we know that it's a very powerful field. What would this thing we call time? I think you can call it that, but it's also fluid. And it can be affected. And so when you have something like these wormholes that might be created or some other technology that comes in and bends things, it makes perfect sense that it might take a while for it to sort of, fall back or erode back into its more original state. And so we can probably eventually find a lot of fingerprints of these encounters all over the world. And I feel like that eventually, as we start finding more and more of these anomalies and overlapping them with places where people have experienced strange phenomena, we're going to find an incredible correlation there. And it's going to sort of unveil that whole new map for us. It reminds me of that story about Benjamin Franklin. He used to sail back and forth between the U.S. and Europe all the time, and we found that mariners were kind of confused because they said it would take 2 weeks longer to travel from Europe to America than from America to Europe, and nobody knew why. And so he started taking these bottles of Madeira, this Spanish wine he liked to drink, and he would dip it into the ocean as he would travel back and forth between America and Europe, and he would take temperature measurements, and eventually over time he plotted all these points, and he was able to realize there was a special current there that he called the Gulf Stream. And he was the first person to come up with this. It's this current that's almost like a warm river that flows within the ocean, going from the Gulf of Mexico across the Atlantic. And if you are aware of its location, then you can either navigate with it or around it. And he came up with a map that showed the Gulf Stream, and he distributed this all over the place. And for years, at least 4 or 5 years, people ignored it. And there were all these mariners and merchants who they say could have saved untold millions of dollars if they had just taken his map seriously and used that knowledge of the Gulf Stream. So I think we're going to find a similar situation here once we start working together in this vast world to plot these various points that are strewn all around and connecting the dots. Then eventually we will have our first glimpse of this brand new highway network of meridians of warped space-time, and that's going to tell us a lot about not only what has happened at those places in the past, but how we might be able to predict when some of these phenomena are going to occur in the future.
Yeah, Joshua, that was fascinating. Thank you for telling us that story about Benjamin Franklin. I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
That is so cool. When we talk about the universe, we talk about time. Then we have to get into consciousness. And I remember an experience I had this would have been 2017, a car accident. I had this feeling that I was going to get in another car accident because I was in one in 2009. And this was going to be either deadly or I was going to be paralyzed. And I remember every time I got in a car that week, I was just overwhelmed by this vision. And I realized, okay, I know premonitions, and this is how I'm going to handle it. Sometimes you can't change what is happening, but you can affect the outcome. So I rehearsed it in my head over and over and over. And I didn't assume for the missing. I go, what is it I do know in this vision? Well, it's coming from the left-hand side. It's black. I'm in my car. The left side door is smashed, and it smashes into me from the left-hand side. So it has to be from someone driving from the left, either when I'm going through an intersection or if I'm pulling out. It just can't be anything else. It has to be from the left-hand side because that's the vision. So I rehearsed always to pay attention to the left first whenever I pulled out, went through an intersection. After about 6-7 days of doing this, I just kind of was slowly starting to forget. I told 2 friends of mine about this. Lo and behold, the event occurred. It occurred at a stoplight. I dropped off some dry cleaning. I was pulling out to make a left-hand turn with the left-hand arrow, and all of a sudden I felt that pressure in my electromagnetic field. As a sensitive, as a medium, this is what I tell people when you deal with your sixth sense, is you feel this magnetic pull or push from one side, behind you, in front of you, and then all of a sudden you put your attention to it, and I see this black Escalade flooring it, coming towards me. So I slam on my brakes because I got the right of way, blows off the light. Then this is where everything changes. When I get the realization, oh my God, this is just like the vision, everything now goes into slow motion. And I'm watching this thing go past me very slow. I'm looking at the details. I can see the passenger. It's a female, dishwater blonde hair. She's leaning against the window. She's obviously asleep. I can see the guy driving. He's probably in his early 30s. He has dark black hair, no facial hair. He's leaning forward, and he's wearing a dark shirt, either dark blue or black. And he's leaning forward, not even paying attention to me. And as I watch them go by, and I see it's an extended cab, all of a sudden it passes my path, and then it speeds up and it's gone. The thing that fascinated me was not that I changed the outcome of this and I did not get hit because I reacted to my sense of field, noticing something that was just about to occur, but that everything slowed down to where it was like frame by frame. I then go back to Joseph McGonigal, who was a remote viewer for the military, and he's written a couple books. I listened to one of his books last year. He talked about a car accident that happened on this expressway, this pileup. He was able to maneuver all around the cars because everything shifted into slow motion. Have you heard of stuff like that regarding consciousness, where everything just goes into this slow motion?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, it's actually not that uncommon. And first off, we have to realize that if you take the biggest human you're going to find out there, and you squeeze all the water and the empty space out of that person's body, the matter that's left over is about the size of a little pea or a little BB that you could just roll between your fingers. And yet somehow within all that, we have our memories, our personality, our identities, and we have no idea exactly how that works. But we do know that there is this little point inside there, which I call the wormhole brain, meaning that there is this little connection between what's happening in your experience and what's happening in the rest of the universe. And it's a flow of information. It's hard for us to understand it because it's like having a caveman open up a TV set looking for the little people inside, and all he sees is a bunch of wires and circuits, and he has no idea where the little people are. And so this little thing, this component that again I call the wormhole brain, is actually a little time machine. And it's not only affected by time, but it also may be able to manipulate time. So what I mean by that is, well, if you go into some restaurant or whatever, and all of a sudden you walk into one of these very small time warps like the one that I discovered that was less than a second, you might pause and say, whoa, deja vu. I don't know what just happened here, but I just got this weird sense that I've seen this before. I've been here before. And on the other hand, sometimes it can be more extreme where you go into a situation and you actually can see years into the past. You can see a setting from the past. And if you start looking at how all this relates to various types of paranormal phenomena, well, of course, it's easy to understand how the idea of fluid time applies to ghosts, because ghosts are usually seen in the past. When it comes to UFOs, it's kind of easy to understand that, because you have the stories about like the guy in Texas on a Wednesday night at 10 p.m. driving his pickup truck down the road, and suddenly here's the big Spielberg flying saucer overhead, and the truck stops, and then the saucer flies away and the truck starts working again. It wasn't like he had to turn the ignition, so it was as if time had paused, and yet he maintained consciousness throughout this, because his brain, his mind, was operating on a separate scale. When it comes to cryptozoology, you have people say, I'm following Bigfoot around or whatever, and all of a sudden he vanishes, and the footprints stop in mid-pathway. But where did he go? Well, if that was a real creature there, he changed his position in space, and space and time are related, so somehow time was a factor. So you go down this whole list of things, but then the big one comes with what we consider ESP, or psychic phenomena, because this is the process by which you can say, okay, if the human brain is already susceptible to these things that we often consider paranormal that seem to be connected to time, then maybe we can tap into that susceptibility, and we can manipulate it so that on command we might be able to look into the future or look into the past. And I must be honest with you here, Chris, now that I am spending so much time in Las Vegas, I use this much to my benefit in the casinos. I've won quite a bit of money here. And so it can be done. It's like you're taking something that's already sensitive to time, but you're trying to exercise it and play with it. And so what you find is that sometimes these dramatic things are they only kick in when you're in a crisis situation. But in other cases, you can actually control it if you pay attention to that wormhole brain, to that connection to the rest of the universe, and you can actually use that in order to manipulate your impression of time, and therefore how you're able to react to these events. And so that's sort of, I think, how it all ties together with basic human consciousness.
I like that. I like that term, wormhole brain. I got to be careful how I use that, though. Some people may take it as, slander, or, don't call me that. For some of the listeners, we've been talking about time. You shared your story at Area 51. We talked a little bit about ESP. What is it that listeners can do at home that they can start practicing, whether it's on a daily routine or work, they can do at work or something during the middle of the week? What would you suggest for them to start opening up to all of this?
Well, if you want to literally start trying to control your brain or your consciousness and its relationship to time, the easiest thing to do is to start with some of these small experiments to see into the future. The easiest thing to do is to simply have a coin. I have a quarter that I always keep on my little table next to my my love seat there where I watch TV, and I know that quarter is there not to be spent. It's there to remind me when I see it to flip it and see if I can figure out if it's going to be heads or tails. Now, it's supposed to be 50-50 roughly. If you do it 10 times, it's more or less supposed to come out to be 5 heads and 5 tails. But if you do this long enough, you'll get to the point where you can start determining. I don't know if you're seeing what's going to happen or if you're creating what's going to happen, but you'll get to the point where, however the cause and effect work, you'll start to be able to figure out if that's going to land on heads or tails next, most of the time. I don't know
Wow.
if anybody can do it 100% of the time, but you can do it most of the time. That's a very, very simple experiment that everybody has access to. But I'll tell you, I wrote an ebook that came out last year called
Okay.
Finding Your Magic. Finding Your Magic. I even had a big event here in Las Vegas where I revealed this, and people came from all over the world. We had the event at the MGM Excalibur there on the Strip, and it was a 3-day event, and everybody had a great time. But what I realized is that since everybody's different, there's not one sort of exercise or technique that works equally well for everybody. And you have, unfortunately, some people who want to improve their abilities to tap into this, and they try one method and it doesn't work for them, and so they just get exasperated and say, this is all a bunch of hooey, and they don't try anything else. But I came up with a system where you can ask yourself a few very basic questions. It's a personal questionnaire that will help you figure out what type of method is going to work best for you.
Oh, wow.
And then the ebook connects you with the method and says, this is your personality is the personality that's most likely going to be good at this. And here's what this is. And here's how you exercise this. And, and here are tools you can use. Here's how to create some of those tools or whatever. And it's, again, you can get this off my website. If I have a curiosity shop on my website, joshuapwarren.com. And if you just scroll down, you'll see Finding Your Magic. And that has been the most valuable resource for people out there who want to basically change their lives and become more receptive to all these things so that they can either experience more interesting things or just have a better life in general, because we all need a little edge. So but that's definitely something that anybody who's serious, I believe, should check into. Finding Your Magic. Its subtitle is How to Hack Reality Through Lucid Living.
Oh my God, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. Everybody listening, go to Joshua P. Warren's website and get his ebook, Finding Your Magic, and see how it works for you. I'm going to check that out too. I appreciate that.
Well, you're certainly welcome, Chris. And you and I, we've been doing this stuff for a long time, and when you meet people who stick with this long enough, you start to see these connections that aren't always apparent to the person who starts out. It's like, for me, I got started out with ghosts. I didn't know that this was going to lead me on a journey that would connect UFOs,
Right?
cryptozoology, and time travel. But you get to that point where you start seeing the universe in a different way. And it's just wonderful to have a conversation with you and for us to sort of help each other describe to everybody else kind of what we're learning about the bigger picture here.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I really appreciate that, and I respect everything that you've done in this field and what you continue to do, and I'm at the same level. It started out with ghosts and this and that and aliens and all that. Now I'm really focusing on consciousness as well as alternate realities based on experiences I've had. And that's a whole nother topic. Maybe we'll talk about that at another time. But I really want to thank you for coming on here. I really appreciate it. Any last words for the listeners?
Well, Chris, I'm excited that I'm working on this new laboratory here in Vegas. So I don't know if I'm going to have this available this year or not. But when I get it put together, I'm going to open it up to the public probably at least once a month and let people come in and see for themselves some of the experiments that I'm doing and see that I'm not pulling their leg. This is real stuff that you can come and witness. And so keep tuned for that. But if you go to my website, I have a daily podcast that's free. I have an e-newsletter, and I'll keep everybody informed there. But Chris, you, as always, are doing fantastic work, and congratulations on all of your success. And my goodness, thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
Oh, I appreciate it, Joshua. And definitely I want to come check out your laboratory when you get it up and running to witness some of these experiments that you'll be doing.
Great. Sounds good. All right. Thanks, Chris.
Well, thank you. This is Chris Fleming and my guest, Joshua P. Warren, and you've been listening to this month's edition of Spirit Talk. See you next month.